Kroger is highly profitable and doing a lot better than it was before the pandemic. So we can see here, and this comes from CW researcher John Marshall, that their operating profit is up by 31%. Their free cash flow is up by 65%, and their adjusted income is 44%. And really, what we mostly want to look at here is their operating profit, which means like how much money they have left over after all of their costs are taken out of the equation. Their operating profit is up by 31% in just 4 years, which is a significant increase for any company. For Albertsons, that increase is much more dramatic. The increases at Albertsons percentage-wise are really stark, with operating profit more than doubling in 4 years. So operating profit is here in blue. It's been up in just 4 years by 136%, going from $986 million to $2,328 million, which is like $2.3 billion. Market capitalization is the total stock value of a company. So you can see here that Kroger's market capitalization, or their stock price, has doubled since 2019. Wall Street now thinks that Kroger is worth almost $47 billion, which is up significantly from 2022, when valuation was at around $32 billion. So we can see, I know it's a little hard to see at the bottom here, but this is 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. And you can see just how much that stock price has increased all the way up to 2025 at $46.9 billion. That's how much Wall Street seems to think that Kroger is worth. These companies are doing really, really well financially. But are workers sharing in the success? Where is all that money going? That's what we'll be talking about right now. So what you see on the screen right now, is the monthly change in the consumer price index for food at home, which is how we measure like the cost of groceries, basically. And this shows the big spike in grocery inflation that we saw over the past few years. The chart starts, I know again it's a little hard to see, but starts in 2019 and goes all the way through December 2024. So grocery prices really shot up around 2022, but average grocery worker wages, which is what we see in orange, has stayed relatively stable since then. There have been some increases, and some of you might notice that these increases around 2022, some of them happened in alignment with the last contract. But otherwise, these wages have remained relatively stable in terms of their change over time, while grocery prices have really, really increased in a very short period of time, over just a couple of years. Speaking of grocery prices, which is something that has been a really hot topic in politics, or just, in everyday life, everyone has been really feeling the heat on the changes in grocery prices. One thing we sometimes hear from customers, and I know one thing we heard when we were standing out on the picket line in Denver at King Soopers, is that grocery prices are already too high. And if we get a wage increase, it's going to mean that even higher grocery prices will start affecting customers. Not to mention that grocery workers themselves, as you know, also have to buy groceries, and are both workers and consumers. What one study found was that wage increases of 10% for workers translated to just 0.36% price increases for consumers. So that's about a third of a percentage. And that is only if the company chooses to offload these increased costs, the increased labor costs, onto the customers, which they actually don't have to do. They can find other ways to kind of eat the costs, or to make up for the cost of the wage increases. We can share the link to this full study if you're interested in reading it. This idea that grocery worker wages are going to increase the price of groceries is a myth. So why are grocery prices going up? Who's benefiting if not the workers? Well, across the entire US economy, CEO pay is out of control. But Kroger and Albertsons is really far outside of the norm using the most recent available numbers. So for all S&P 500 companies, which is like the basket of the most, profitable, successful companies in the US, the typical CEO made about 268 times the median worker. So this over here on the far left is the S&P 500 average ratio. Every year they calculate ratios of the compensation of their CEO to the average compensation or the compensation of an average worker at that company. So they publish those ratios. The average ratio in 2023 for all S&P 500 companies was 258 times. So the CEO was making in annual compensation, salary, bonuses, stock about 258 times as much as the average worker, which is shocking enough. But if you look only at food retailers, that number is about the same. It's 283 times. But in 2023, the Albertsons CEO made 475 times the typical worker, while the Kroger CEO made 502 times the typical worker. And it gets worse because these numbers are actually down from recent years. The ratio of CEO compensation to worker compensation reached an all-time high in none other than 2020, which was the year that was probably the hardest to be a grocery worker in recent memory. But rather than adequately compensating the workers, these companies decided to compensate their CEOs. Rather than compensating workers who put their lives, their health and safety on the line during the pandemic to keep the stores open, Kroger and Albertsons were just flooding their CEOs with cash. So for Kroger in 2020, that ratio was up to 909 times. And that trend still continued for them in general. So they really bumped it up in 2020, and the ratio continued to remain high, even though it was slightly less than it was in 2020. So in 2022, they went to 671 times the average compensation. And at Albertsons 2022, their high was 506 times.